So just back to how a systematic review process looks, we have finished with the pre-work, then the review authors go back to their desks, probably at home right now, and conduct the systematic review. But when we get to the part of the systematic review, we may have used the transfer guide to refine the review question. You may have used it to define your inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. But thus far, this hasn't been done. But what we're at now is we're extracting relevant data from the included studies. So in addition to normal data extraction on study characteristics, participants, interventions, etc., we'd also extract data where available on the length of homelessness of the participants, the quality of the usual services, and the climate in the study setting. As you can imagine, some of these factors won't be available in the actual study, and you might have to go elsewhere to find the information. Most studies don't report whether it was hot or cold when they conducted their study, for example. And this next stage would be to synthesize your data. In this case, we came up with a review finding based on 10 studies, all of which had low risk of bias. And the review finding was that housing programs lead to more days in stable housing compared to usual services. So those 10 studies contribute data to this one review finding. We're assessing transferability for a single review finding, similar to how we do it for making grade assessments, risk of bias assessments, and grade CERQual assessments. Those 10 studies have many characteristics, but with respect to the transfer characteristics, you can see that some of them have greater and less length of time homelessness. Some of them have higher and lower quality usual services, but all of the studies come from colder climates. So we're assessing the transferability of the review findings for each review finding. We would do this for a global context and in a region context. I'm going to spend the next few minutes going through how we would do it for a Norwegian context. So the first transferability factor was length of homelessness. This is not a real forest plot. This is made and adapted for the purpose of the presentation. But as you can see, there is a slight difference when you look at the studies that had less than 6 months of homelessness at baseline compared to the studies where participants were homeless for more than 6 months at baseline. In a Norwegian context, this would mean that we would have some minor concerns about the transferability of the review findings, given that there is a difference in studies that come from contexts where participants are homeless for longer or shorter periods of time. For the quality of usual services, we see something similar, that there is a slight but significant difference between studies where they have a high quality usual services compared to studies where they have low quality usual services. In the Norwegian context, this again would give us minor concerns. We had minor concerns that studies coming from low quality usual service contexts would be transferable to the Norwegian context. And we might expect that the overall review finding might be slightly less, for example, in Norway than it is in a different context, or in the review finding, sorry. However, we see all those studies came from cold climates, so we have no concerns there. We make a transferability assessment based on these 3 assessments of the transferability factors we identified, and come up with an assessment of transferability of review findings table, where we have the review finding, the transfer factors, an assessment for each factor, an explanation for this assessment, and the supporting studies for each factor, as well as an overall assessment at the bottom. So the last stage in the transfer approach, and we have not, excuse me, we have not done this far, is to support grade or a grade CERQual assessment. So in grade, the assessment that we would hope to support is the indirectness assessment. Indirectness, just a reminder for those of you familiar with grade, is looks at differences in populations, interventions, outcome measures, or indirect comparisons. For a grade CERQual component of relevance, you can have direct relevance, indirect relevance, or partial relevance. Much like the risk of bias is an underlying support for the risk of bias component in the grades or the grade assessment, we hope that the transfer assessment could be an underlying table or support for making your grade indirectness assessment. So that would look like this. Similarly, transfer could support the grade CERQual component of relevance by supporting the assessment of relevance in the table. And we hope that this makes it more transparent, because I'm willing to admit that I have gotten to a grade or a grade CERQual assessment for indirectness and relevance and thought, sure, okay, I'm sure it's okay. But I have no systematic or transparent way of backing up that assessment. I haven't really looked at indirectness systematically throughout the review process, and I certainly hadn't before done it with cooperation with stakeholders who are much more knowledgeable than me in most cases. So a grade or a grade CERQual assessment might look like this for Norway. We might have serious concerns for indirectness because minor concerns regarding differences between the studies and the review context with respect to length of homelessness and the quality of usual services, but no concerns regarding the differences between studies and review context related to the climate. If we were making a grade assessment for the global context, excuse me, we would have gone through the previous slides and the previous stages where we did subgroup analysis and come up with no concerns, not serious concerns, because there's no substantial differences between the studies and the review context with respect to length of homelessness, quality of usual service, or climate.